Good morning if you're in New York, like Mr. Justice, and good afternoon if you're in South Africa. Thank you again for joining me for the third TK show of the year. This one's a bit special because I think we have a proper veteran of interviews in South Africa and a political commentator and author. Just reading your CV, Mr. Malala, it's long, hey? So I know I always know people say this, but I think in this instance it really does apply. There is no introduction needed for Mr. Justice Malala. If you don't know him, it basically means you've not been paying attention to South African politics for the last few decades. So, Mr. Justice Malala, it's such an honor to have you on the TK show, and yeah, hoping to have a good discussion with you.
Thank you, TK. Thanks for inviting me. I'm a great fan of your policy work, so it's lovely to be in conversation with you.
No, great honor, and again, thanks for that. Look, the focus of today's discussion, what people should be knowing about at the moment, is Mr. Justice Malala's new book. As you can see it, apologies for it's a bit blind there, but it's titled "The Plot to Save South Africa." And it's just recently released. I think it's received glowing reviews, Mr. Justice Malala. It's another one of yours, which has received glowing reviews. So you're kind of making us feel a bit guilty that we still have to get off the crease to actually write a book. But no, so thank you. And yeah, I think before maybe we just go in there, and I think we're discussing it all fair, that it's always so weird to interview somebody who's interviewed you. And I think you've been such a fixture on South African politics. I think there's probably three or four people I always remember when you think about South African politics and the commentary behind it. It's John Perlman, Tim Modise, and obviously the Justice Factor, which we all used to watch even with my dad. So just maybe walk us through that before we get into the book, just how he actually got into politics. The book, I think, at the prologue really does give a good introduction to the fact that you were actually a journalist. So maybe just how did you actually get into politics?
I think for many Black South Africans in particular, and I think to some extent white South Africans, the political journey begins with your life. I was born in Johannesburg. My father worked on a mine. My father's work was on Elof Street in Johannesburg. So my formative years were spent on the mines. Had what they called a family compound. That's where if you were doing a job above the laborer's job, you ended up. So my father had managed to study at night while he worked as a laborer at this mine and became a clerk. In fact, I recently found in his papers a payslip from the 1960s, and it designated him as Mabalane, which is what used to be in what was called Fanagalo, basically he was a wages clerk. So in many ways, we moved from Elof Street because of the Group Areas Act, and we had to leave what was then designated a whites-only area, and we moved to Soweto. From Soweto, we moved to Hammanskraal because the 76 riots broke out, and my father thought his kids were going to be in the line of fire, as many other parents did, and they took their kids off to the rural areas. So we ended up in a place called Hammanskraal, which was, in Hammanskraal, there was one village called New Eersteres. And New Eersteres exists primarily because people who had been moved by apartheid from Lady Selborne, other parts of Pretoria, which were considered white, were moved there. And it was a polyglot area. At school, we learned Setswana. At home, we spoke Sepedi. On the streets, our neighbors were people from say, the colored township of Eersteres, who were considered too dark, so they spoke Afrikaans. So you have this weird mixture of people from all over, basically dumped in this one area. Anyway, that's where the politics came from. You know, this place was just a polyglot village. In the 80s, in the late 70s, you know, Steve Biko was a big thing with my brother and his friends. In the 80s, the UDF is born. I remember the first guy to go to university in the village went to TEF, what was TEF Loop then, the University of the North, came back with loads and loads of pamphlets saying, you know, so if you liked reading like me, you start getting these things and you start reading and you think, oh my word, this is the world beyond this. So my family ended up being virtually everyone. My brother was detained, my sisters became active, the whole family was active in politics. And that's how, even when I became a journalist in the 90s, in my 20s, I instinctively, you know, that was the first thing I wanted to do. I wanted to write about the violence at the time, the political violence mainly. I wanted to write about the political developments. You know, it was post Mandela's release, before 1994. So I wouldn't say it's in my blood, but it's certainly been in my background, in my consciousness, in my conscientization for a long time. And it starts small when you see small bits of injustice happening, when you see your family moved about and you start realizing that we're actually moving here because of these issues, not because we want to move and those kinds of things. So that's how I ended up, you know, in journalism, in commentary, and you know, I always had a few things to say. So I ended up writing, but to finish off the point about, you know, you have been on some of the shows that I have done, the Justice Factor certainly, and I think the last time you were commenting on the November 1 local government elections in 2021, we spoke then. But that's how the journey went until I got into television commentary and so forth. But my first love has always been books, TK. You know, that is where the genesis of this book, my previous book, reading for me is something that opened a pathway to being able to speak to people in academia like you, people in all facets of life. I might, you know, I found that has always been a very powerful force that has given me access even. So I wanted to write a book, and this one is particular. The new book is particular because it's a story that I've wanted to go back to for 30 years, and I've finally done it.
No, and it's quite the read. And look, I was going to say, and that look, most of the book, I think we should maybe just recap quickly. Some of the books you've written, we have three in particular. We have Now Began Our Descent, Let Them Eat Cake, Before the Rains Come. And one thing I did want to ask is that the titles, and I think also the books, are also quite seminal. I mean, we have now begun our descent. For many people, you know, when it came out, and I'm sure you remember, people were still at that, you know, that euphoria of 1994. For people to say such, it was still like, no, what's this? What? Because I remember the commentaries, what Mr. Justice speaking about, he's being, you know, the language is being counter-revolutionary, this one. Yeah, so, and now to come to this one, I mean, yeah, I think just before we get that, are you specific about writing moments in time in history, or is it that it just almost dawns upon you in terms of what you see?
You know, TK, thank you. I've been lazy in many ways because that's the way I could have done it. Taken a moment and sort of, you know, that the two last titles, The Plot to Save South Africa and We've Now Begun Our Descent, are sort of in that vein. But the first two books you mentioned, you know, the first book, Before the Rains, is a very slim, very small book. It's out of print now. But it was a very optimistic book in the sense that It's fiction. I wrote it in the 1990s, soon after 1994. And it's actually a book about a community building a school, and it's based on the community that I grew up in Hammanskraal, because there were no schools when apartheid dumped all those people in the area. So they built their own schools. So the schools I went to, my primary school was not built by the government, it was built by the community. People paid money. If you didn't have school fees, as they call it, building fees, you did not get access. And it was terrible. There were many poor people. In fact, in Hammanskraal, everyone is poor, but there were people who had no means whatsoever to pay. And at the beginning of the year, half of you would be in class and half would be waiting for the end of January or the end of February. And the principal would kind of say, oh, you can come into school and so forth. But everyone tried. So those schools were built primarily by the community. So that book was about, I wanted to write a book then that paid tribute to those people. They actually built schools. They didn't wait. The apartheid government did it. So what the government did in those days, and it was with the Witwatersrand government as well, in 1977 afterwards, when Witwatersrand was sort of the homeland in charge, which would say, no, we can't build you a school, but we can give you teachers. So they'd pay the teachers. There'd be a school complement, and with time they started sending like some books sometime, but you were responsible for yourself. I wanted to pay tribute to those people, and that was the book, and I loved it. I enjoyed writing it. It just almost wrote itself, because I knew I just had to make up the characters, but the story was pretty much as it had happened in that village. The second one was a collection of my columns. As you know, I love food, and I wrote a column for the Financial Mail at the time where I would eat and comment on the political situation in the country, which was a fantastic outing for me always. We have now begun a decent was different, because I was becoming hugely concerned in the mid-2000s with the issue of leadership, the issue of how we had gone from Nelson Mandela and his leadership and his type of leadership, driven by values, ethics, to the leadership of Jacob Zuma, which was devoid of those things. I think when all of us saw Waterkloof Air Force Base being used by a family to essentially assert their dominance over South Africa. Many of us were worried, and there were many other things. The scandals were coming out, the allegations that people were being offered cabinet positions by this family and not by President Zuma, who is the constitutionally appointed person to do so. This is when the concern for me rose to the extent that I wanted to say, we are not a failed state. We are not but we could become one. We could become seriously entangled in the politics of states that don't work, and a cult of personality and a cult of individualism, where the leader does what I believed President Jacob Zuma was doing. And I think the Zondo Commission into state capture has revealed even further. So that was a warning light. That was my book, and I still take it seriously, that we need to be aware of these things. I think many times in political analysis, we'll say, this is the situation as it is. But I do like to say to people, don't say, I didn't give you my projection, and my projection is this.
That's good.
So the key thing about we've now begun our descent for me was that I wanted to say, let's not in 10 years' time say we didn't say these things, or that TK didn't warn us that if we continue with this, then the trajectory is this. And I wanted to lay those out. And also, towards the end of the book, I did try to say, this is how we get back, and institutional integrity and rebuilding were key parts of that. And I don't think we've gone far enough in doing that. Hence some of the problems that we talk about. The final book is what you're reading. The Plot to Save South Africa is a story of the day and the 9 days after Chris Hani, who was Nelson Mandela's protege, was murdered. He was murdered by a right-wing racist man from Poland who came to South Africa, got given under the apartheid government's immigration scheme, in which it sought to attract what it called capitalist East Europeans. So his papers were done very quickly. He was sponsored to own a factory in what was then called the homeland of Witwatersrand. And he did well here, made money and so forth. Then when the subsidies to those areas, like where I come from in Hammanskraal, there used to be Babelegi and so forth. But those industrial zones started collapsing with the end of apartheid, and he went broke. And he, together with an influential right-wing politician, conservative politician, Clive W. Lewis, they murdered Chris Hani. Chris Hani was the most popular, most charismatic leader in the ANC in the early 1990s. Many spoke of him as a possible successor to Nelson Mandela, either immediately when Mandela stepped down or in time, but certainly he was in the top 3 people who would have been considered for leadership in the ANC. By doing so, Clive W. Lewis and Janus Wallis hoped to trigger a war between black and white, and to trigger the army to get rid of F.W. de Klerk, stop negotiations, and return us all to the nightmare that had held in South Africa before 1990. So that's the premise of the book. But essentially, if you say, why did I do this? What are these moments? I wanted to write another moment. I think the key, and talk about this, TK, the key thing about our moment now is leadership. It's we're all sitting there saying, where are the leaders? Why is it one problem just persists for years? In fact, the electricity problem has persisted for 2 decades now, over 2 decades now. Where's the leadership to do this? And then you look at all sorts of other things, the inflation problem we're going through, the economic issues, the inequality, the poverty, the schools, kids dying in pit latrines and so forth. Where's the leadership? So I wanted to remind South Africans and all of us, humanity in general, about a time when leadership mattered, leadership intervened, leadership led from the front. And I think Nelson Mandela, not Nelson Mandela alone, but Nelson Mandela and many around him, including his opponent, F.W. de Klerk, did a series of things in that week after Nelson Mandela, after Chris Hani was murdered, that I think display leadership at its best.
Yeah, no, I'll just probably ask you to pause there and just remind everybody. Hopefully, it'll come out better now. This is the book type. This is the book. Hopefully, if I just try to do this, it'll come out a bit better. Yeah, this is the title. You can see it here. But I want to maybe take us to the way you've set the scene, which is something. Because I put it down as page 3. The often discussed but forgotten environment around the negotiations. I think people quickly almost jump towards depending, I guess, where you sit politically, the sins of Codesa, but they don't actually speak about the environment. And I think you do a very good job. I know it's only page 3, it's a prologue, but I think from 3 all the way to 9, you do a very good job in almost painting. Like I was telling my producer Ludwig that the book it's got this bitterness because I come from Everton, which is south of Joburg, and I can actually remember when Chris Hani died, and just the thinking around there. I could stand to be wrong, but I do know he did visit the Vale Everton once, and I think it was at the Methodist church. I snuck in. Obviously I wasn't allowed to go in, but it's just what he means. And I think sometimes the environment which you paint, for instance, on page number 9, where you speak about the point Chris Hani raised against the government at the time, to say, look, you're part of this violence. And I think maybe for us who's maybe the younger generation, we sometimes get clouded by Codesa, but forget about the environment. So maybe if you could just walk us through that, because I think you do a very good job in just walking us and reminding us, hey, this was not just about, we just get to negotiations. There was a circumstance of violence happening outside. If you could maybe just walk us through that a bit.
Yeah. Look, I mean, there had been political violence in South Africa, largely stoked by by covert intelligence units in the government of the day. That war had been going on, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, where after 1983, it was almost constant. Fights between allegedly the IFP, which historically was sponsored via the KwaZulu government, led by Mangosuthu Buthelezi, and the ANC, with leaders such as Harry Gwala and so forth. But what people kind of paint this picture that Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison, and he, together with his team, the Thabo Mbekis, the Cyril Ramaphosa, and many others around him, went and negotiated with the National Party. And depending, as you say, and the narrative now, and I'd like to confront this narrative, that, they sold us out. And 1994 happened, they were given the country, and that was the end of it. It wasn't at all like that. In 1990, Nelson Mandela walks out in February. By March, April 1990, there were killings happening in that violence that had been the norm in KwaZulu-Natal had spread to what was the PWV then, which is Gauteng largely now. People forget that there were train killings where TK and Justice are sitting in a train coach from Soweto, and the train is coming into the city, into Joburg, and a man or men walk in with AK-47s and just shoot up the train, and it's mayhem. People forget that in places like Everton, in places like Duduza, in many parts of the Vaal, Sebokeng, for example, people just in the night, you're asleep in your bed with your children, and 200 armed men go from house to house and just shoot up the houses. People forget that the Sebokeng massacre, the Witwatersrand massacre, 69 people murdered in one night, and all the perpetrators escorted, allegedly still, by police vans from the local hostel. So this was a time when, personally, I'd get up in the morning, turn the radio on, and it would be, what is the death count today? And it would be 5 men were killed in blah, 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 in Mshaya Zafe hostel. 15 people killed in a taxi shooting, and the taxi shooting was emanated, it would be hostel dwellers shooting at a taxi full of people going to work in the early hours of the morning, and so forth. This was a very volatile time. This was a very dangerous time. so you had the township violence stoked by forces within the apartheid government, as we got to later know via the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Then you had on the political front the rise of right-wing racism, such as the AWB, many other forces. General Constant Viljoen had left the army with other generals, and they were training people, white people, in paramilitary combat and so forth. So this happens as CODESA, and CODESA breaks down, and you have the other negotiating forums started post CODESA. It's all happening at the same time. And so this was a hard, tough process, and it took time. In 1990, people said Mandela's out, the ANC has unbanned, the SACP is unbanned, let's go to freedom. People thought it would happen in 1990. It didn't happen in 1990. 1991. In the meantime, on average, TK, people forget, between 1990, February 11, Nelson Mandela walking out, and April 10, 1993, 11,000 people had been killed. Not people dying in their sleep, people dying, being shot in the head, being shot in the body, being mowed down in machine gun fire, in political violence. That is an average of 4,000 people, 3,500 people a year. You can imagine what that means a day. It's extraordinary, but we lived through that. So there is a lot of talk about, yeah, we were sold out and so forth. I don't subscribe to that. I think people underestimate what this country went through in that time. But it was a hugely uncertain time, a desperate time, and it was a tinderbox. It was waiting for people like Valush to come along and set it on fire. So the key thing that I wanted to illustrate was, how do you frustrate people who want to destroy a country like that? And in that week, I basically follow Nelson Mandela from the time he gets the news in Kunu, and then try to examine some of the actions that he took to frustrate that thing. You know, Nelson Mandela was actually interviewed, I think it was on the 27th of April, 1993. And he was asked what actually happened in that week of Chris Hani's murder. And he told the interviewer, you know, that week, those guys wanted war to break out. They wanted Black people to be so angry after losing their hero, to go out in the streets and to say we want blood. And they wanted white people to say, yeah, we told you these bloodthirsty Blacks just wants to do this and so forth. So they basically threw the match in and waited for Black and white to go against each other. And Mandela said, we frustrated them, but we by being disciplined, by asking our people to be disciplined, we frustrated them and they lost. So, you know, I think that those steps, and you know, we can talk about what happened, but I believe 10 different things, steps were taken by these leaders, by Nelson Mandela, by others around him, which I think were pivotal in turning things around that week.
Yeah, and I think and I love the way you just painted it, and also how you almost bring it back to today's time, the crisis of leadership. And look, maybe, as I said, you do a good job in discussing something which is not always covered enough, namely actually putting a body count to the environment. Like you said, the narrative does become quite simplistic sometimes between sold out and this and that. but people don't understand the factors, or I don't think they understand. Let's say I don't think they quite respect the factors like violence and how that could actually be a possibility to say, listen, you can have or maybe it's the beauty of living in South Africa now is that you can theorize about what I could have done differently, which many politicians seem to do, forgetting that violence, a bullet is a very sad way to come to an end. And and maybe also this, the way when I was reading that part was like, I think it does have a bit of a generational mix to it. Maybe the older generation who are a bit more cognizant of what violence, and South Africa is still violent, but I think the political violence which you described, where you're just losing 4,000 people or so a year, it's very etched into, I'd say, my parents' generation. Because I remember that's one of the reasons they pushed me off to boarding school, because living in the Vaal, they were like, "Hi, no, it's a bit safer there." So you're right in saying, and I do love that you cover that, and it maybe does also, like I said, it does kind of maybe have to make us think heading into elections next year, if parties, any party, we're not going to mention names, but I think everybody kind of gets the gist, who would be okay with using violence as a means to governing a country. I think the way you describe it, it kind of does show that it's probably not the way to go. But there's also little nuggets you have, like for instance, on page 10, and this is why I have to say the book was very well researched, and I guess maybe it's a journalistic background. For instance, you speak about when President Mandela was taking that phone call from Miss Barbara Masekela. So I'm thinking, no, I know this surname. And I love the way that you just introduced it. They said the person in line was Barbara. And then you just give a description. Oh, this is Mr. Hugh Masekela's sister. I'm like, oh, wow. I did not know that. Because it was like, wow. So I just love how you actually even able to give her the characteristic of saying, look, don't just be fooled by the surname. This is someone who stands by her own right. She's got her own history. But it also just did make me think a bit about, the ANC elite, because I think it's something we don't quite explore enough. And I love how you were able to do that in the book. Just because I was like, man, the surname sounds familiar. And then like, oh, because I think we're used to the big surnames, Mandela, Sisulu. But I love the way you even were bringing it down to people. You're like, I never thought that person was linked to the ANC. Just, those little things you have in the book, which are just so revealing, if you don't mind. Like, how do you put that together?
I'm in many ways, TK, I was lucky in the sense that yourself, myself, many others, we talk about Chris Hani, and we know Chris Hani. It's the big names you talk about. So we know all these people. But the story of what happened when Chris Hani was murdered has always been told in compartments. So someone will say, I'm going to interview Janus Valus, the murderer. And so they go and speak to him. No one has connected him to Clive W. Lewis, how they met and how they actually feed into the world. They were members of an organization called the World Apartheid Movement, which is a neo-Nazi grouping. Now, all over the world today, right-wing leaders are making it into legislatures. The world is leaning increasingly right. So what they were doing in the late 90s and in the late 80s and early 90s was, you can see the genesis of these right-wing movements in South Africa. So what time does, I think for all of us, is give us the opportunity to connect the dots, as Pravin Gordon once said, and begin to see what is really at play. So one of the key things for me about that, the murder of Chris Hani, is that people will show you Mbazima Shilowa and Tokyo Sexwale and Jill Marcus outside the house and Tokyo Sexwale crying and so forth. The story of Jill Marcus is not told enough. The story of Mbazima Shilowa, Jill Marcus was at home when she got the call. Mbazima Shilowa, who was known as Sam Shilowa at the time, was driving his mother to Moria. And these people come back. So I wanted to bring all those stories together, but also stories that we haven't even talked about before. I focus on a group of young ANC Youth League members in the Eastern Cape, who, you know, killed a lawyer, a white lawyer, who they didn't know. But this was the one lawyer at Rhodes University in the 70s who, you know, he spoke Xhosa, he represented Black activists. You know, it was the one guy that couldn't have killed, but this is what your Janus Valus is. So with time, I had the luxury of almost being above it and looking at all these and linking them together, and that gives you an opportunity to, you know, my book TK was double the length it is, and because there are so many little nuggets and stories that one could have put in there, that I did put in there, and you know, because the book is published in South Africa and the US. My US publisher said, you know, people want to hear what happened, not some of the beautiful little nuggets you appreciate in the Barbara Masekela phone call. You know, but Barbara Masekela, not many people would want to know that, you know, after she went into exile, she did so much in the US. She taught at universities, she raised money for the ANC, then she went to Lusaka and, you know, headed up the ANC's arts section and so forth. There's so much there. But it's just one individual. There are so many stories in there. So you know, for me, one of the things about the investigation of the case is why did the government, why did the police, why did the government choose its biggest, its worst, its most terrible torturer to be the person to interrogate Janus Valus? And what does that mean? And why weren't we told then that, no, we've got, this man had interrogated and harmed people like Ibrahim of the ANC, who probably was the most worst tortured person we got to know about in the late 80s. They chose him to lead the investigation, but they didn't tell anyone about it. So he did the interrogation in the background, and other cops would appear in the foreground and tell the nation, oh, we've got him, we've got this, and so forth. So there are all of those stories. With the help of, you know, transcripts from the TRC interviews and so forth, I could pull it all together. But it's in a way, it was an attempt to say, here is the story from a distance, and these are the circumstances, and this is what happened, and this is what you might know and what you might not know. So it's a whole lot of things that hopefully bring it all together to make a little bit more sense about what happened in those 9 days and those 9 days of crisis. I also wanted to say, TK, you know, just talking about what happens today, about what crisis does, it sometimes brings out the best in people. It sometimes brings out the worst in people. And in that week, you could see Mandela and his best, Mandela leading the nation through this crisis. And in those 9 days, from the assassination itself to the funeral, the burial of Chris Hani, you see Mandela emerge as this leader, as he pulls the nation towards peace, underlines that message again and again, and holds in many angry people, and you can't blame them, the Peter Mokabas of this world, the Herigwalas, the Winnie Madikizela Mandelas of this world, and holds them together and says, we are close, and we've got two things we want. We want an election date, and we want a transitional executive council. Many people could learn from how a crisis is handled in this case. The second thing is how you see F.W. de Klerk begin well. The first instinct is to have a conversation with Nelson Mandela, and he does that. And then he unravels. He starts shouting, basically. And for the rest of the week, he's shouting, he's unleashing the army and so forth. And we can learn, what not to do from that leader. So I think in these times of crisis, you know, I hope many in the ANC, in the current leadership, many who will come after the ANC, can look at crisis and say, what can I learn? What can I do that perhaps helps resolve a situation instead of making it worse? And I think that's some of the lessons from that week.
No. Yeah, I think it's very apropos the way you put it. Just probably two things which you've just touched on. It's also related to probably pages 5, which is, and it's funny because you would think the book speaks about Chris Hani, but what I love about the book is you almost tantalize a bit the reader to say, not now. You touch on parts about it, and maybe it just brings us full point to just the man himself. I mean, this little antidote you have where, look, I think people know Chris Hani, the NK leader, Chris Hani, who was in the SACP. But I think the way you also almost like an onion, you unravel him to say, no, this was a thinker. Because I think other books have sort of touched on it, that not so much I would say the juxtaposed version of Chris Hani was always Thabo Mbeki. It was those were the two always put together, and President Mbeki was imbued with the gift of intelligence. But the way you do it here, the fact that it would seem as though Chris Hani was very cunning and calculated. I think you speak about when he approached, is it Falyun, to speak. He knew his background, that this is a person who loves Latin. And even the Klerk, like, he just had this ability he knew what they thought about him, but he had the ability, and I think you write it quite well, how he could just change people's perception of them and almost leave them unraveled to say, this is not who we thought we were. So maybe just touching on the man a bit now, Chris Hani.
Yeah, no, I loved Chris Hani for that. Many people, I think you make such a brilliant point, TK, when you say, you know, it's always been Thabo Mbeki, the intellectual with a pipe. This is a man you can talk to. This is a man you can do business with. You know, he's suave. He's known to enjoy a bit of Lagavulin or whatever the whiskey is, and so forth. You know, and Chris Hani and a few others were depicted as the ogre, But this is a guy who went to a Catholic school in Kofimvaba, you know, a village called Sabalele. He walked kilometers every morning and every afternoon to and from school. He was fascinated by Latin from this Catholic church, by the priests. And when he went to university to Rhodes, well, first Fort Hare and then to Rhodes, he followed along the classics and so forth. And he kept that up. He loved Shakespeare, he loved reading, and he didn't stop. When he joined MK, he didn't stop. And the anecdote you refer to is the first meeting with the National Party. It was in March 1990 when he comes back from exile. And remember, you know, there were two people that the Nats absolutely hated. You know, the National Party was interesting. They hated the ANC and Black people who stood up against apartheid. They hated them in general, but they hated communism even more. So Joe Slovo, Chris Hani were the absolute, don't bring them in. And so Chris Hani, for our viewers, Chris Hani arrives, and it's all the propaganda about the red danger, the Roy Gefar, is in there, and this man is terrible. This man will do terrible things to you. He goes in. He knows that Falyun has, you know, a PhD from Oxford in the classics, and I think I refer to it in the book, but you know, so he makes a beeline for him. He knows that this guy, so he goes to him and he says, you know, I think, and starts chatting to him about his particular area of study. And so these two men, this guy is like, what? And so both him, both Hani and Paulo Jordan and Viljoen get into this very highfalutin discussion. What was I can't remember what the exact subject matter was.
Let me try to find it.
but it was something about, I think, Greek myth.
Yes.
And so it's this kind of almost scholarly discussion while they're having a tea and scones before they sit down. So after that, they hold a meeting, and the National Party guys have a little meeting afterwards. And Viljoen is like, you guys, you're absolutely wrong about this guy. This is the man to talk to. This is a guy with a this is a guy who's been everywhere, has always thought this. In just that one meeting, in a 30-minute discussion, Chris Hani had made him his biggest fan, and he's done it before. Being a priest, being a priest and a leader in the Anglican Church, Archbishop Tutu was very much someone who moved among communists and so forth, but he didn't like the Stalinism support of some aspects of Stalinism within the ANC, and he made it known that I'm not too sure about this, the form of communism that you guys talk about. When Chris Hani came back from exile, the first thing he did was to say, Arch, before we start talking, man, can we sing a hymn composed by it was composed in the 1800s.
Toga. I think Toga. I always get his
Yes.
yeah.
And so I apologize to you, TK. I seem to have forgotten a lot of stuff in my own book.
No, it's for, in fact, it's for the reader. They'll only get it when they buy the book.
Very good. But they sing this song together, and it's sublime. And Tutu says, this guy, who is this man who does this? And so the two of them just became very tight friends and comrades for the next few years. So many people from the Eastern Cape will remember the song Itingali. I forget the song. I forget the hymn.
Yeah, because actually, my wife is from KZN. She's like, no, everyone knows it. Never knows that song.
No, it's one of those.
It's one of those, like he said, when you
sing it, and everyone in there.
Everybody knows, yeah.
But that song was composed in the 1870s by a Black South African priest, and it's a state. Tiosoga. There you go. Absolutely. I'm glad we have an academic in the house.
And everything I think you've spoken about, for those that do buy the book, you'll find on page 26. Even Viljoen is on page 26.
There you go. But yes, so I wanted to remind people of Chris Hani. So a lot of people now talk about the ANC and its practices. People need to go back and say in the late 1960s, Chris Hani was interesting in that he was one of MK's first real soldiers, if you will. He was deployed with just over 50 other MK cadres from Lusaka to go into southern Rhodesia to attack the Rhodesian forces and establish what the ANC believed at the time would be a corridor between Zambia, taking arms via southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, into South Africa, and we'd have a a proper insurrection in South Africa. So he was sent off. And everyone in the ANC will tell you, go to meetings and it's Viva Wanki Spolilo. That was the name of the operation. And it's great. And Chris Hani went along. He was one of the leaders of the mission. They meet up with forces of the Rhodesian army, and they engage them. The story goes that their first engagement, they caught those guys by surprise, and they won. They killed 2 people, I believe. And then there's a second engagement, and they suffer casualties. But the key thing here is that, one, they were very, very badly kitted out. Their shoes were not proper. They didn't have enough water. They ran out of water. They ran out of food. They were starving in the bush, and they lost half the complement of people. So when the Rhodesian forces hit them again, Chris Hani and 11 others retreat and go back to, and in fact, they flee into Botswana. The others are arrested and are sentenced to jail in Zimbabwe. So the whole mission was actually a total disaster, and it was a logistical disaster because they had not been given enough guns, enough equipment. They couldn't even navigate through the bush. And when he comes back, he writes this now famous creed to his leadership saying, this is what you did. This is what you didn't do. This is how you let us down. And this is what you've done since we've come back. You haven't even debriefed us about what happened in there. You just basically sent us off to die. We come back. You don't even care what happens to us or what happened out there. He's arrested. He's threatened with being sentenced to death by the ANC, and so forth and so forth. But he stands his ground. And because of what he did, the ANC reforms itself. It holds the Morogoro Conference, in which it says we will not be doing this again, and this is how we're going to do this. It professionalizes itself a little bit, and so forth and so forth. So this was a very brave man. This was a man who would surprise you by his erudition, by his education, by his deep, deep thoughts. This was a man who was not at all the caricature that, the sophisticated Mbeki, the warmongering Chris Hani. He was all that. He was a soldier. He was an intellectual. He was all kinds of things. Not a perfect man, of course, but a really maybe a good leader for us in a post-apartheid South Africa, in a democratic South Africa. But his life was cut off too short.
Yeah. And I think that brings us to page 20, because for me, the headline, and I think you describe it quite well, I put it as the callous waste of life on page 20, where you describe the events leading up to his death, and the fact that, which I didn't know at the time, I think couldn't maybe think back that far, that their daughter had to witness this. And I think everybody knows about Miss Hani, and look, her anger towards Mr. Walus, and just the way you bring it in really was like, oh wow. You sympathize, and you like, and I think that's the only thing I could write is, what a callous waste of a precious life.
I know, but a lot of us look at what is transpiring now and the anger of Mrs. Dimpho Hani at the release of Janus Wallis, and because we are able to, this is the wrong way to put it. Many people would say, oh, we apply our rational minds to it. And that rational mind says, well, he served time. Our laws say this and this, we should have, he was due for parole at this point, and so forth. But none of us have lost a husband and a father to our kids. None of us, the child who witnessed that murder of her father in front of her at age 13, 14, lost her father, herself later died. Many people would have said that she had a troubled childhood because of what she witnessed. You know, that family has taken a lot. And I mean, you know, they're not unique. Many people who stood up against apartheid have suffered massive, massive personal tragedies and continue to do so. So when Mpho Hani is angry, I might not agree with her, for example, what she says about the judiciary or about Chief Justice Zondo. But I would never stand and say she is wrong to be so angry about the murder of her husband. It's deeply personal. It's deeply disconcerting. It's deeply painful that here we are, 30 years later, there's only 2 people that we know for sure were involved, and that's Clive W. Lewis and Janus Wallis. But there were people who held them. There were people around them, and they looked to me very much like operating like a cell where, you know, this one procures and provides the gun, and this one provides a list, and this one provides this, and those questions remain about what exactly happened here. And then, you know, the questions about a wider conspiracy have not been totally answered. So I feel that pain, and that family has suffered a lot of pain. And Mpho Hani, as a woman, as a South African, as a mother, as a wife, I feel her pain terribly.
No, and I think, like I said, the beauty of this book is that I think like I said, it reminds us of a period in time, but it also, like I said, with the beauty of, I think, hindsight, kind of just also makes us reflect about the now. And what are the things which I think you do very well, like what are those little antidotes you give? Because I think, like I said, it's also a teaching book for me. When I was reading it, it was a sad thing as well when I read this, because I was like, we're going back now to when then to be President Mandela gets a phone call, and he then instructs Miss Barbara Masekela that, listen, go call the 2 old men, Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu. And it made me think that, you know, it's so often, I get South Africa's love of making many political parties, but, you know, and I think you do it well here, when people speak of Mandela, sometimes there is a mythology around the man. But when you actually read, like you do when you explain here in your book, that no, this is a guy who did what I think what one might say the disciples of Jesus did, which is you go back to source to say, hey guys, things are not great. Any help you might want to give. And I was thinking, who do our, in inverted commas, leaders go to now, where they can sit down and say, I am not doing well. The economy is not doing well. I'm not doing well. What do I do? And I'm thinking, obviously, of our number one at the moment. Can he go to President Mbeki and say, hey, I am not doing well. What can I do? Because I think you tied off so lovely, because it's almost like that's a key leadership lesson, that there's always a saying in South Africa, everybody wants to be a leader of a political party. No one wants to follow. And that's the weirdness of Mandela, that he was a follower.
Yeah. I think there's a lot, you're absolutely right. And I hope, I mean, that's one lesson, that he spoke to so many people. He consulted, he listened, and he acted after taking all that advice. It wasn't sort of, oh, I've talked to a lot of people, but I still don't know what to do. He took the advice, even if it was unpalatable to him, he took the advice and said, this is the best possible way out there. I think, you know, part of talking about Chris Hani and talking about Nelson Mandela is for now. It's not just for you and me to remember, for all of us to remember a great human being who died, a great human being who was a hero in that week, that's Mandela, and the many others who participated. But it's for now. It's for us to say, once we were warriors, once we were good and strong, and we did these amazing things. How can we not do them now? What's the difference? And I think for me, the key thing was to almost, the life of Chris Hani is almost a reminder of what one can really achieve, and where we've gone wrong. You know, for me, Chris Hani is a dangerous man for South Africa today, because he reminds the current crop of leaders of what could have been, because he spoke about corruption. He spoke about forgetting where the ANC comes from, forgetting about the poor, forgetting about the conditions that can exist even after freedom. And his time in exile was very much like, don't think that many collapsed countries in Africa and elsewhere didn't have leaders like of the caliber that South Africa has, but the lure of money, the lure of riches, he spoke about Mercedes Benzes and so forth, is something that we need to be careful about. And so everything that we're doing now, it's almost that people, not just Chris Hani, many others, are hovering over us and saying, wow, you be careful. You're about to make the racists who used to say, you are going to be this. You're satisfying them. You're giving it to them on a platter. And so to remember him is to remind ourselves that we've lost our way. We can get back, but we better start working to get back onto that way.
No, I like that. To remember him is to remind ourselves, and I think you're right. It's often forgotten. And look, I think just to the viewers, it's just almost important to say this. We're only on April 10th, by the way. That's how good the book is. That you can literally spend an hour just focusing on on chapter 1, which is April 10th. And like I said, I think it's one of those books, and I have to say it again, people have to buy, because it's what I love is it flows quite nicely. But those little anecdotes that you have almost do kind of, I think, prick us today to say, look, that's something which I didn't know about. Wow, why are we not thinking more about this? So I think, Justice, without taking too much of your time, I've seen the book has received rave reviews, and I think it is flying. When are you, because I have to just say this, when are you going to be in SA to promote the book so people can also have their questions to you?
No, absolutely. TK, I'll be at Exclusive Books Centre on the 1st of June. I'd love people to come and to ask tough questions. I think we all need a debate about these issues. I'll be at Love Books, also in Johannesburg, on the 2nd of June. Also open to the public. In Cape Town, I'll be at the Book Lounge on the 31st of May. I'd love people to come through as well. And I'll be at the Kingsmead Book Festival on the 27th of May. So those are some of the events that I'll be participating in. But, you know, if there's more, I'll put them up on my Twitter handle at Justice Malala, and I'll keep everyone informed.
No, I know I said this, and I will keep to it. I will be there, I know, at the Sandton one for the 1st of June, so my book can actually be signed. So I'm looking forward very much to that. And I think, look, as we head towards closure, and just to get your yeah, just your mind around, because you straddle two continents, dare I say, and there's always an oddity between South Africa and America. I think sometimes we're closer than we'd like to admit in terms of how we view things. Just yeah, in light of you've written this book, you're in the States. Where do you see us from your vantage point in the States, where I think you would know that to say we're in crisis is so normal that South Africans have the ability to forget that we're in crisis. Just how is it just received that side? If you have any contact with South Africans there, and those that are, I think there's always people that like South Africans. Just yeah, how
Yeah.
do you view that? How do you view us from that side, as straddling two worlds?
TK, you know, South Africa is a very, very, we are blessed. We are lucky. We've managed to build a reputation in the world. People want to listen to South Africa. If you go to the United Nations, people want to hear South Africa's view, have always wanted to hear South Africa's view, and in many ways have taken a cue from South Africa on how diplomacy, diplomatic relations, policy towards the continent, not just South Africa, is handled. We've just gone through April 27, Freedom Day. You know, in South Africa, not many countries get to have their flag and their name in New York on the big ticker tape and so forth. The mayor of New York welcomed representatives. You know, it's a big thing. South Africa, post 1994, the Nelson Mandela period has built itself as a serious player on the international stage. My fear, so just globally, my fear is that we are becoming slightly a laughing stock. Our stance are supposedly non-interventionist, non-partisan, non-aligned stance on the Russian invasion of Ukraine has made us seem as if actually we support a country which has invaded a sovereign state. We seem to be perpetually in defense of Russia, and we don't seem to at all speak up about the stealing of children, for example, by the Russian Federation from the Ukraine, as alleged by the International Criminal Court. So a lot of people are asking questions internationally about South Africa and its, if you will, its ethical leadership. I think that over the next few months and years, you will find that South Africa, in negotiating, for example, AGOA and other treaties, will find itself not being viewed as a friend of the West, but as an unreliable partner. I think there is a lot of talk about, well, it looks like the Mandela generation is finally out, and what happens to South Africa now? Russia seems to view South Africa very favorably at the moment, but it's worth looking at, for example, trade figures between South Africa and Russia, and looking at trade figures between South Africa and the US, for example, or Germany and so forth, and saying, if we're talking about South Africa as a power and as an independent economy, who should we be talking to? Who are we talking to? If you look at, for someone like me in the media, I always, first, when I assess a country, I look first at how many journalists they have in jail. South Africa does not have any journalists in jail. The United States does not have any journalists in jail. But in Russia, in China, among our friends in the BRICS countries, I look at India and how, if you are a media organization like the BBC, you're suddenly being targeted for your taxes and so forth and so forth. So Globally, I think the sun is dimming somewhat for South Africa. We are no longer seen as that country that upholds human rights, that stands with those who stand for human rights, for the rule of law, and so forth. I think the Ukraine war, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and our stance towards that, is really damaging us right now. From a distance, I mean, I can't really say from a distance because I spend every second or third month in South Africa. I was just there last month. I'm here. I'm back there next week. So in a way, 12 hours of load shedding is what my mother is experiencing right now. Now, my mother's business, and her business is talking to me, is highly impacted by that. And by that, I mean, she cannot make phone calls when she wants, because when the load shedding hits, the electricity pile, the cell phone masts don't have communications. Yeah. She can't speak to her church group. She can't speak to her friends. She can't speak to her son. She can't speak to this, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. That is one woman in Hammanskraal whose life is hugely impacted by this. Think about the industry. Think about this. This is a crisis, TK. And South Africa seems to be, let me give you an example of incompetence. Incompetence is when you appoint a minister of electricity in February 2023, March, April, May. You're still asking Treasury, what should his job be? So what has he been doing for 3 months? This is unacceptable. Even for someone like me, I have been a great champion of Cyril Ramaphosa as possibly someone who would clean up our institutions, return them to where they should be. I'm afraid this is an absolute failure and disaster to appoint a minister whose job you don't know, and you're now 3 months later casting about. And I said this in columns and so forth 3 months ago, that what are you doing with Pravin Gordhan and Gwede Mantashe, two men who are probably his most trusted lieutenants in that cabinet, and he appoints a third person? What has happened is that they are all fighting each other, and the president is nowhere to be found. So this is just, we haven't spoken about the real problems, the unemployment, the poverty, the inequality. Yeah. These are the real structural issues that we should have been going at with a battering ram, and we're not even doing that. So the outlook is sadly, in my view, very bleak. I worry that continued talk of a total blackout, a collapse of the electricity grid. One, you mentioned that when my book, We Have Now Begun Our Descent, came out, people said, what is this one going on about, that I'm being too bleak about the future. But I think because we didn't do some of the key things that we should have done back then in 2015-16, we now face payback for all those failures. And I think we close. Are we a failed state, as so many people are saying? I don't think we're there yet, but we can't keep saying we are not when we begin to behave like a failed state. And this is pivotal.
No, thank you very much. And hopefully in the coming decades or so, there'll be the Plot to Save South Africa Part 2, which will learn the lessons, I think, which you do put across in the book, which I encourage all our viewers to really go by. It's a good read. It's a great history, but like I think that the way you also put it, it's a great lessons for the now and the future. Mr. Justice Malala won, I think, in 2013. You're called one of the most interesting Africans. You won that award along with Mr. Paul Kagame and the like. Thank you so much for your time, and really was a privilege and honor to speak to you, and yeah, to go over the book. Cannot wait to finish it. Especially the last part, where are they now? I'm saving that. I can't really wait for that one. So thank you so much for your time, and yeah, all the best that side. And we will be seeing you, as he said, as he's doing his book tour in South Africa. Please do visit, buy the book. Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Justice Malala.
Thank you so much, TK. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.